The midday heat of the outback was oppressive, but inside the abandoned shearing shed at Blackwood Station, the air felt like ice. Marcus clicked his heavy flashlight onto the splintered timber floor. As a structural engineer checking forgotten properties for heritage registration, he was used to isolation. This ruin, however, sat 3 hours down a corrugated dirt track that felt like the edge of the world. Outside, the twisted shapes of dead red gums stood frozen against a grey sky. Inside, the stillness was unnatural. No flies buzzed, no birds called. He stepped deeper into the gloom. The floorboards groaned beneath his boots. The air carried the sharp, sour stench of old lanolin and dry rot. He took a photo of the rusted wool press. In the flash of his camera, he saw a shape. A figure stood in the far corner of the shearing deck. Marcus froze. His breath hitched. "Hello," called out. His voice sounded small, swallowed instantly by the vast tin roof. No answer. The figure stayed perfectly still. It looked like a man dressed in a heavy flannel shirt and grease-stained trousers, standing with his back to Marcus. Marcus rationalised the sight. It was a leftover mannequin or perhaps a bundle of old burlap sacks. He took 3 steps forward, his flashlight beam cutting through the floating dust. The light hit the figure's head. There was no hair. There was no skin. The back of the skull was bare, weathered white bone split completely down the middle. The temperature dropped instantly. Marcus could see his own breath blooming in white plumes. A sound began. It was a low, wet tearing noise, like meat being pulled from a hook. The figure started to turn. Marcus tried to move his legs, but they felt heavy, like lead poured into the floorboards. He watched in horror as the shoulders shifted. The head spun around with a sickening crack of vertebrae. The face was gone. Where eyes and a mouth should have been, there was only a hollow cavity of black rot, dripping with liquid that smelled of stagnant bore water. The split in the skull opened wider, like a laughing mouth on top of its head. A raspy, choking wheeze filled the shed. It sounded like a dying man trying to clear fluid from his throat. "You're late for the cut," a voice whispered. The sound didn't come from the entity. It echoed directly inside Marcus's mind, cold and scraping. The entity took a step forward. Its movements were jagged, twitching violently like film skipping frames. The rusted shearing shears on the wall began to rattle against the corrugated iron. The noise grew deafening, a frantic metallic clanging that filled the space. Panic broke the paralysis. Marcus dropped his clipboard and bolted for the exit. Behind him, the wet, heavy thud of bare feet slammed against the timber. It was chasing him, moving with impossible speed. The air around him turned so cold his skin blistered with frostbites. He burst through the sagging double doors into the blinding Australian sun. He didn't look back. He sprinted to his 4-wheel drive, threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed the locks down. Hands shaking, he fumbled the keys into the ignition. The engine cranked, died and then roared to life. Before hitting the accelerator, he looked up at the rearview mirror. The shearing shed doors were wide open. Standing just inside the shadow, right where the sunlight met the dark, was the figure. It lifted a pale skeletal hand, its fingers ending in sharp, broken yellow nails. It wasn't waving goodbye. It was pointing directly at the passenger seat next to Marcus. Marcus turned his head slowly. The passenger seat was empty, but the vinyl was deeply depressed, as if a heavy weight sat there. On the dashboard, the air vents began to blow air that smelled of old lanolin and stagnant water. Marcus slammed his foot on the accelerator. The 4-wheel drive roared, tyres spinning violently in the loose red dirt before gripping the track. Dust exploded behind him, swallowing the image of the shearing shed in a thick brown cloud. He drove like a madman, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He refused to look to his left. He refused to look at the passenger seat, but the smell was inescapable. The vents continued to pump out the foul, icy stench of stagnant bore water and rotting wool. "Look at me." The voice scraped against the inside of his skull. It wasn't a sound heard through his ears. It was a thought forced into his brain, cold and oily. "You're not there," Marcus screamed into the empty cabin. "You're back at the shed. I'm hallucinating. It's heat stroke." The digital thermometer on the dashboard clicked down. 38 degrees Celsius, 30 degrees Celsius, 15 degrees Celsius. 4 degrees Celsius frost began to spiderweb across the inside of the passenger side window. Marcus kept his eyes locked on the corrugated dirt road ahead. The track stretched out for miles, flanked by endless miles of grey skeletal salt bushes. He just needed to reach the main highway. Then he felt the shift. The heavy vinyl of the passenger seat didn't just stay depressed, it shifted. He heard the distinct creak of the seat springs' compression under a shifting weight. Whatever was sitting next to him was leaning closer. Out of the very edge of his peripheral vision, Marcus saw a flash of grey flannel. "You think you left?" the voice whispered in his mind. The tone was almost mocking now. "But you're still in the shed, Marcus. You never broke the lock." A wave of intense vertigo hit him. For a split second, the bright red dirt road ahead blinked out. In its place, he saw the dark, rotting timber floorboards of the shearing shed rushing toward him. He gasped, jerking the wheel, nearly flipping the vehicle into a ditch. He blinked hard. The road was back, but his hands on the steering wheel were trembling violently. Was he actually driving? Or was he losing his mind, standing frozen in front of that entity in the dark, imagining his escape? His phone, resting in the center console, suddenly vibrated. The screen lit up. It was a text message from his boss, sent hours ago when he still had reception. The preview read, "Be careful at Blackwood. Property abandoned since 1924. The last owner went blind trying to blink out what he saw." Marcus felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He reached out a trembling hand to grab the phone, wanting to read the rest. As his hand crossed the center console, a freezing, wet grip clamped down onto his wrist. The skin was slimy, smelling of old death. Marcus looked down, despite himself. A pale, skinless arm extended from the passenger seat, its fingers squeezing his wrist with crushing, inhuman strength. He looked up. Sitting in the passenger seat was the entity. The split skull was wide open, staring right at him. But it wasn't just a hollow cavity anymore. Deep inside the black rot of its face, Marcus saw two eyes. They were his own eyes. Marcus tore his wrist from the creature's icy grip and snatched his eyes back to the road. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He needed to ground himself. He needed to prove that what he was seeing in the cabin was a trick of his mind, a severe panic attack brought on by the isolation of the outback. He forced his eyes upward. He looked into the rearview mirror. The road behind him was completely gone. There was no red dirt track. There was no billowing cloud of dust. Through the back window of his four-wheel drive, Marcus saw only the interior of the Blackwood Station shearing shed. The rusted wool press sat frozen in the shadows. The corrugated iron walls loomed high and grey. The vehicle wasn't moving down a road at all. The mirror showed the truck parked dead still right in the centre of the rotting timber floorboards. "I told you." The thought scraped inside his head, synchronised with a wet, bubbling hiss from the passenger seat. "The track ends here." Marcus blinked violently, tears of pure terror blurring his vision. He looked out the front windshield. Ahead of him, the bright Australian sun still beat down on the saltbush plains. The GPS screen on his dashboard still showed his icon moving down the line of the track. He looked back at the rearview mirror. Still the shed, still the darkness. He was caught in a horrifying geographical split. His body felt the vibrations of the moving truck, and his eyes saw the open desert ahead, but the mirror insisted he had never left the spot where he first encountered the ghost. Suddenly a loud thump echoed from the roof of the car. The metal ceiling dented downward above his head with a sharp screech of buckling steel. Marcus flinched, ducking his head. He glanced back at the mirror. In the reflection, three more figures were crawling down from the rafters of the shearing shed, dropping onto the back tray of his utility truck. Their skulls were split open. Their movements were jagged, twitching violently as they scrambled toward the cabin's rear window. Through the real windshield ahead, the desert road began to warp. The straight dirt track started to curve into an impossible, endless spiral that led nowhere. Marcus realized the entity wasn't just sitting next to him. It was rewriting his reality. If he couldn't trust his senses, he was already dead. Marcus jammed his foot onto the brake pedal with all his might. The reaction was instantaneous, violent, and completely fractured. Through the front windshield, the four-wheel drive behaved exactly as it should on a dirt road. The vehicle skidded sideways, the anti-lock brakes pulsed aggressively under his foot. Loose red gravel sprayed against the undercarriage like gunfire, and Marcus was thrown forward against his seatbelt. But through the rearview mirror, the physics were entirely different. In the reflection of the shearing shed, the truck didn't slide, it stayed parked perfectly still. However, the sudden force of the phantom deceleration ripped through the interior of the cabin anyway. The entities crawling across the roof and the mirror were thrown forward, slamming into the rear glass with the wet, heavy sound of fracturing bone. The glass didn't shatter into the desert air, it shattered into the darkness of the shed. The rear window exploded inward. Freezing, stagnant bore water splashed over Marcus's neck, instantly numbing his skin. Along with the water came the smell, overwhelming, choking and thick with the scent of old wool and dried blood. The truck ground to a halt. The dust cloud Marcus had kicked up ahead began to settle, drifting lazily in the bright Australian sunlight. Silence descended on the outback. Marcus sat panting, his forehead resting against the steering wheel. He didn't move, he barely breathed. Through the front window, a solitary wedge-tailed eagle soared high in the blue sky. Nature was functioning out there. Then he heard a wet, dragging sound from the back seat. He didn't need the mirror anymore. The split in reality was closing and the shed was winning. The icy, localised air inside the cabin was so cold that frost was now thick on the steering wheel, numbing his fingers. "Good stop!" The voice rasped in his mind, louder now, echoing with the metallic resonance of the tin shed. "Now get out of the truck, the shearing is finished." Marcus looked down at his hands. The skin on his knuckles was beginning to turn a sickly, bruised grey. The rot was spreading from his mind to his flesh. Marcus let his hands fall from the frozen steering wheel. The fight evaporated from his muscles, leaving behind a heavy, hollow numbness. His skin was the colour of winter clay. He couldn't feel his fingers anymore. There was no escaping a ghost that ruled his own mind. He unbuckled his seatbelt. The metallic clink sounded incredibly loud in the frozen cabin. The passenger seat shifted again as the flannel-clad entity leaned back, its split skull tilting in what felt like silent approval. "Smart lad," the scraping voice echoed in his brain. "The sun always sets, Marcus. The dark always wins." Marcus reached for the door handle. It felt like a block of solid ice sticking to the numb flesh of his palm. He pushed the door open. He didn't step out onto the red dirt track of the outback. His boots sank straight into soft, grease-slicked piles of raw sheep's wool. The bright Australian sky vanished. The blinding sun was gone, replaced instantly by the suffocating, shadow-drenched gloom of the Blackwood Station shearing shed. The air was dead heavy with the suffocating stench of dry rot and old lanolin. Behind him, the door of his four-wheel drive clicked shut. When he turned around, the truck was gone. There was only the rusted wool press towering over him like a monolith in the shadows. From the darkness beneath the rafters, figures began to descend, dozens of them. They moved with that same jagged, frame-skipping twitch. Their clothes were rags of grease-stained flannel, their faces were hollow voids of black rot, and every single one of them had a skull split completely down the middle, white bone gleaming in the dim light. They formed a silent circle around him. The entity from the truck stepped into the centre of the ring. It held a pair of heavy, rusted steel shearing shears. The blade scraped together with a horrific metallic shriek that vibrated in Marcus's teeth. Marcus didn't run. He didn't scream. The psychological trap was complete. His mind had fully accepted this as his ending. He simply closed his eyes and knelt on the rotting timber floorboards. "Time for the cut," the collective voice of the shed whispered in his head. A sharp, searing cold sliced into the back of his neck. 3 weeks later, a search party found Marcus's four-wheel drive. It was parked perfectly straight, dead in the centre of the abandoned Blackwood shearing shed. The keys were still in the ignition, turned to the on position, though the battery had long since died. The searchers found no signs of a struggle, no tracks leading away into the desert. But when the police forensic team examined the vehicle, they found something they couldn't explain. The interior of the truck was covered in a thick layer of frost, despite the 40 degrees Celsius heat outside, and sitting neatly on the driver's seat was Marcus's structural report clipboard. Written on the final page in Marcus's own handwriting was a single repeated sentence that grew wilder and more jagged until the pen had torn through the paper. "The shearing is finished. The shearing is finished. The shearing is finished."